Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Trail Talk High Pointing Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren, and I'd like to welcome back Mihai Skye Marthaler, and Paty Mataskella for today's episode called What's in a Name? Now, shortly after the Tennessee High Points name was restored back to its Cherokee name, Kuwohi, Mihai contacted me with the idea for an episode solely dedicated to the names of high points. He suggested a panel discussion, and immediately I thought of my two favorite high point historians, Skye and Paty. Now, everyone on this panel has been a guest on the show previously, but if you're a new listener, let me fill you in on the impressive background of the members of this panel. Mihai Georgulescu is a California peak bagger with over 2,000 total ascents and over 1,600 unique peaks to his name in a mountaineering career spanning 15 years and counting. Mihai has completed 41 state high points and has successfully summited several international high points. Mihai holds a bachelor's degree in history and environmental science, along with a master's degree in geographic informational systems. He is an immigrant from Romania with a natural aptitude for languages, of which he is comfortable using 5 interchangeably. And he has firsthand experience with the importance of proper cultural connections. Mihai has been a guest on episodes 17 and 45 of this podcast. Skye Marthaler is a longtime high pointer on a journey to document each state and territory high point. One of his great joys is telling stories about high points and the role they play in history. He is the creator and host of the popular YouTube channel, The Rooftops of America, where he features his love for history and high pointing in episodes dedicated to each high point. Skye loves to find intriguing facts and tidbits about people, places, and things. He's been a guest on episodes 51 and 62 of his podcast, and I will provide a link to Skye's YouTube channel in the show notes. And also, Skye was very humble when he provided his bio to me, and he didn't announce that he has a line of merchandise for the Rooftops of America. I'm using his mug right now, and it says, "One man, 56 peaks, one mission, climb them all." Skye, thank you.
Thanks.
Paty is a high pointer, long-distance hiker, and amateur historian. She has so far completed 49 state high points and is working on summiting the 36 county high points in her home state of Oregon. She is a current member of the board of directors for the High Pointers Club and writes a recurring column in the High Pointers Club quarterly magazine Apex to Zenith, where she digs into the background and stories behind the names of various state high points. Paty began writing about the high point names in her blog titled Outdoor Pilgrim, and she's currently working on a book about the high points. She has previously been a guest on episode 27 of this podcast, and I'll provide a link to her blog in the show notes. So everyone, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Lauren.
For having us.
All right, well, let's get into it. I'd like to open this discussion with the most recent high point name change, Kuwohi. Members of the High Pointers Club who received the Apex to Zenith magazine know that this change made the most recent cover of the magazine and a featured article. So let's get into the name. Paty, can you give us an overview on this Cherokee origin?
Yes, of course. So the Cherokee people have lived in the region of what is North Carolina and Tennessee for a very long time, and they called this mountain Kuwohi, which means mulberry place. And for them, it was a high point of their indigenous traditional homeland. So much like us, and we have the pride of maybe the high point of our state or the high point of our nation, that's the high point of their Cherokee nation. Of course, the Trail of Tears occurred in the 1830s, which moved many of the Cherokee out of the region. And as more American pioneers moved in, they came up with their own names, some of which are Smoky Dome and Old Smoky. And so I'm not quite sure how far you want me to go down the rabbit hole on this, but I will say that there was a dispute between Thomas Clingman and Elisha Mitchell over North Carolina's high point, and this one that also straddles the North Carolina border. They went back and forth a little bit about North Carolina's high point, and then he went out on an expedition with a naturalist in 1858, I believe, and felt that he had now discovered a higher point that Mitchell had discovered. And long story short, a surveyor came in and and determined that no, in fact, Mount Mitchell is the higher of the two high points, but did name this Clingman's Dome in Clingman's honor. And so for about a century, it was known as Clingman's Dome. However, the Cherokee people, who have a very long history with it, petitioned the Board of Geographic Names to have the traditional name restored. And that's kind of where we stand today. The board voted on it last year. They unanimously, 12-0, supported the change. The Cherokee people still do a lot of their indigenous rituals and education on the mountain. And for those who have visited this mountain, they know that it's inside a national park. And the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior fully supported restoring the name.
Thanks, Paty. Mihai, what are your thoughts on this name change?
I visited Klingman's at the time in 23. I don't have any strong issues with the name change. I think it's okay to have the indigenous name for the time being, but probably we should keep the old name as official as well. And as we'll get into the discussion later, there are several international examples of other peaks that have multiple official names in various languages. And I think repeated name changes just kind of encourages a lot of controversy from various sides of the aisle. I think ultimately it's the locals that should have the last word on it, but we should also preserve the history that comes with naming. So in that respect, I think there needs to be at least a note made of the fact that it was called Klingman's for so long and why.
That's interesting. Now, Skye, a year ago, you put an episode on your YouTube channel featuring this peak. Can you give us some insight into its geographical significance?
Yeah. Geographically, as already mentioned by Paty, it does straddle the border. It's one of several. Ironically, North Carolina has multiple state high points that straddle its border that are not its state high point, both the one in South Carolina and Tennessee. It's part of the Smoky Mountains, and historically that is an incredibly rich environment. Lots of stories, lots of legends, both in recent history, both in native history, going all the way back to even prior to the Cherokee being there. When you're talking about the Mississippian cultures, this is the most visited mountain range in the United States. By its Smoky Mountain National Park, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is far and away the biggest tourist trap in the national park system. We're talking 15 million people a year. Mm-hmm. So it brings up a really interesting situation because this is, if you were going to ask most U.S. citizens or people that visit, this might be the only high point they ever bag, unintentionally, most likely. But it is also, to touch on what Mihai said, a great opportunity to showcase the history of a place. And when it comes to the geography of it, all I can say is you should go check it out because it's absolutely amazing. You have these 6,000-foot peaks stretching, it's quite stunning.
You're right.
I don't know if I'm quite answering the question there, but...
No, that was great. That was great. It is stunning, and there's a reason there's so many visitors each year. And I think that Gatlinburg is another tourist trap right outside of the park, in my opinion. Now, I need to preface question number 2 by saying that what I love about the podcast is that it's a place where you can come, and there's a lot of political controversy always occurring for some reason in our world. And what I like about the podcast is that you can come here to get away from all that. And we can simply talk about the outdoors. We can talk about high points. And right now we're talking about names. Having said that, we are recording this on January 21st. Yesterday was the inauguration. And it was announced in the inauguration that Denali will be going back to Mount McKinley. So I'd like to talk about recent High Point name changes? And particularly, what do we think about this one? Do you see it happening? What do the locals think? And also, let's get into the name change process. We'll start with Mihai.
Regarding Denali, I think reverting back to the native name is actually more appropriate for that mountain, just because William McKinley had little to do with the mountain itself. He never set foot in Alaska, and the name kind of stuck because a sourdough thought that it was a good idea to bring up the president from Ohio, where he was also from, during the gold rush in Alaska. So it has really nothing to do with the local culture. In that regard, it's just a way to appease the Ohio delegation in Congress to vote for whatever they need to vote. But I think it's more of a nod to the Alaskans and the people inhabiting that land to choose what they want to name. And as we know, the local indigenous cultures are still around, so they can still claim not ownership of the name, but a bigger stake in choosing this name. So I think they should be driving the name process. Again, like with everything else, setting a name to something is a form of cultural appropriation, I think. And as we all remember, history is written by the victors, right? So we have to keep that in mind when we think of names and why they have those names and how many names can something have to accurately reflect the communities around it.
Mm-hmm. Skye, what do you think about the Denali versus McKinley situation? Do you see it happening?
There's a longer answer to this, but that's for a different podcast. I would say, in a nutshell, it's been McKinley before. It'll be Denali again. It'll be Denali in the hearts and minds of most Alaskans. Or McKinley. The place name, this is, in my mind, it sort of touches on the issue in Tennessee, because we'd like to think that the Cherokee are in Oklahoma because of the Trail of Tears, but the eastern band of the Cherokee is still in North Carolina. They're still in that area.
Yeah. Fascinating
story behind there. So there is, what Mihai said, this, when you name something, that cultural appropriation thing is very real. To tie it into a different perspective, one of my favorite things about high points, or some of my favorite named high points, are the ones that are named that reflect the story of the people and the place that they are. And Denali, in my mind, I'll continue to call it Denali. Because that's how I view it. And I think that'll be the case for a lot of folks. It's an interesting situation because most of on the federal level, for the delegation, the Alaska delegation, senators, congressmen, they're not interested in that. Mm-hmm. So, in a nutshell, how much political capital is going to be spent to do this, or is it a performative thing?
Yeah. So, okay.
I don't know if that quite answers the question.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah. Paty, what are your thoughts?
Well, I did have a few moments before the podcast to read the executive order that was signed. And if you know a little bit about how the Board of Geographic Names works, the executive order directs the agencies that put members to the board to put new members there, and it directs the Secretary of the Interior to use the same process that changed it from Denali to McKinley, or vice versa, McKinley to Denali and back. So can it legally be done? Yeah, it probably can legally be done. But the question I think that this podcast really is looking at is, why do we do things and should we do things? Because those are different questions, right? Mm-hmm. And so, looking at Alaska, and this is the one high point that I haven't visited. So, someday I hope to climb it. And if I do, I will probably, in my mind, always think of it as Denali, even though I've known in my lifetime to be under both names. But I just think that the name Mount McKinley was always much more popular in the lower 48 than it was in Alaska. The people of Alaska, the mountaineers who have climbed it, the senators who are there, representing the state right now have already set out press releases on it, and they still think of it as Denali. And much like Skye, I think in my heart it will be Denali. And I think it has a much longer tradition of using that indigenous name throughout our memory than some of the other high points do, right? So I don't know. I think that it's really hard to blend all of our cultures here in America, right? It's really hard to not dismiss history and not to create more friction over should we name it this, should we name it that. I do like the idea of places having more than one name and being known as more than one name. That's not, great for maps, though, right? So you can't put every single name on a map. Otherwise, you might not be able to read the map anymore. But this one's a hard one. This really is a hard one because I think the majority of people who like to climb this mountain think of it as Denali. And the national park that surrounds it is called Denali as well.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Just out of curiosity for the panel, would your mind change if McKinley had summited the mountain? Skye, we'll start with you.
Okay, because there's a couple examples here. Leonard Marcy, the governor, never did anything with Mount Marcy. Mm-hmm. But he is very much responsible for Ebenezer Emmons surveying that mountain. So it makes sense in a logical way. Like, okay, my patron, it's this old thing, like my patron funded this, let's recognize the name. Mm-hmm. So that logic makes sense, even with something like Humphreys Peak. Humphreys never made it to Arizona, but George Montague Wheeler was working under his orders. He's the chief of engineers at the time. So it makes sense. McKinley, that's the thing. Like, if McKinley had done something associated with the peak, I'd be much more generous with my perspective on it. But this is one of these cases where there wasn't.
I agree. And also, maybe if he had more of a role to play in the state of Alaska, too, that could affect the name, I think, as well. Mihai, what do you think?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to bring up right now. So McKinley wasn't involved with anything Alaska. He wasn't even the president when Alaska was purchased from the Russians in 1867. So it was just an accident of history that some guy that hailed from Ohio and happened to be in Alaska looking for gold decided to honor the current president at the time, which was McKinley, by naming what turned out to be the highest mountain in the state. So in that sense, like Skye was saying, I don't think there's any historical basis for keeping this name, except that it has already been bequeathed to the location. And then so it's been carried through generations. Like Paty was saying, the protected area around the mountain, which is Denali National Park and Preserve, retains that name and will continue to retain that name because when the park was designated, it was designated with a native name. So it kind of makes no sense to have the actual highest peak named something and then the park something else. We either have them both named the same or we choose a completely different name for everything. So, which is a much more onerous process. But in order to honor the local heritage and the local communities, I think in this case it should go with Denali, the Great One. So
yeah, that's very good. Paty, can we move on to Black Elk Peak and Mauna Kea? And can you explain in greater detail the Board on Geographic Names?
Okay, so the U.S. Board on Geographic Names is a federal agency, and it's the brainchild of a guy named Thomas Mendenhall. And Mendenhall was an American physicist and a meteorologist. and he really liked order. He's one of those scientific minds that was just about order, order, order. And so he's responsible for a number of scientific systems like weather signals on railroad trains being standardized and monitoring stations for observing earthquakes and their magnitude. Big advocate of the metric system. And so one other place where he really felt that we could use a little bit more order was in the standardization of naming places. So in 1890, he reached out to a bunch of geographers who were prominent in their field and some government agencies, and he said, could we get together to resolve disputes on namings and spellings? And this was important because, this is a time when the field was really growing after the West was really being explored and mapped more. And so you've got phonetic spellings. Cartographers love to do their very best to try to keep the names, but we don't always know how to spell a lot of these indigenous names because they're oral traditions. And so you do the best with the language you have. And so at some point, like Mount Katahdin or Katahdin, had about 20 different spellings of its name on maps. And so that was somewhat confusing depending on which map you were picking up. And so all these different variants left room for confusion for people. And so by putting this board together, they were able to standardize how things were spelled on maps and standardize the naming process itself. And so you've got a bunch of early policies that are somewhat interesting. The first one is you'll notice that there are very few apostrophes in place names. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One reason is an apostrophe just kind of hangs out there and doesn't really attach to the letters. And if you look at it on a map, it can look like a rock. And so if you're sailing in the sea and you see this little dot there, you might think there's something that you need to detour around. In reality, it's apostrophe. So apostrophes aren't in there for that one reason. And they're also not in there because apostrophes generally signify possession of something. So if it's Paty's Mountain with an apostrophe on there, it signifies ownership. And of course, we don't want to necessarily name something, signify if it's named in somebody's honor, that they in fact own it or have greater rights than anybody else for that. So what Mendenhall was doing was putting together this board, and there are currently 6 permanent members on the board. They're the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, which is the parent agency of the Forest Service. The Department of Commerce is has NOAA underneath it. Homeland Security, Interior, and State. And then there's also a couple of other members who are not permanently voting members. But the board leadership generally changes every 2 years, and they get hundreds, if not thousands, of applications to change or rename things every single year. So this is a very busy board. There are also states have their own boards as well. So we were talking a little bit earlier about Denali, and the state of Alaska's Board on Geographic Names approved that name change in 1975. And so the state legislature in Alaska asked the U.S. Board of Geographic Names to make the same change. So it, of course, did not happen, and so we could get a little bit more into that. But each time somebody submits an application, sometimes it's a state board of geographic names, sometimes it's a historical society, sometimes it's a private individual, the board needs to look at it and say, okay, should we make this change? And it's not enough to just go in there and say, this is the old name. That is not a basis to change a name. There has to be more. There has to be something compelling for the board to change the name. And so, and why would we want something more compelling? Well, first and foremost, we don't want to overwhelm the board with constant requests for name changes. They're busy enough. But every time you change a name, there's a considerable cost of money to change that name, right? It has to change on maps. It might have to change on signs. It might have to change on businesses that are outside or near, that location. So as we talked about with Denali, if it changes to McKinley, that T-shirt you have that says Denali might be a souvenir or a collector's item. But also, that company that printed up those shirts, may be losing money as well. So once you get to the board, you've got a very careful historical look at it. You get buy-in from the community, because if there's opposition from the local community, that's a reason for the board not to change the name. And we can talk about that later as we get into maybe Mount Albert and how the College of William and Mary really wanted to make a change there, and the local community in Leadville shut it down pretty quickly with their opposition. So, and another reason that the board is important is you have this pitfall of tautology. Tautology means when you have two words that mean the same thing right next to each other. So we don't want to name something Mount Katahdin, because Mount Katahdin means Mount Greatest Mountain. That's a little bit redundant. So
Like colorful Colorado.
Exactly. Well, exactly. Yeah, Colorado. Or red Colorado even would be another example, where you've got the two synonyms right next to each other. It just doesn't make sense if you know the origin of the words. And another thing is that's maybe somewhat interesting about the board is once a feature is named, you can't unname it. You can change its name, but you can't unname it. So that's where you really need to have a little bit of careful consideration and pause, and are we making the right choice when we name it? Maybe put in the same amount of consideration into it as you would put into your child's name, and not make it something on a whim. So in a nutshell, that's what the board does. And so you wanted me to kind of circle back and bring this back to Black Elk Peak and, Hawaii. With Black Elk Peak, most of us know that it was once called Harney Peak, and it was named after an Army general, somewhat controversial. And the Sioux Nation lobbied the federal government to change the name back to somebody who had a little bit greater connection to South Dakota. Harney did have some connection to South Dakota while he was in the Army, but he isn't somebody that you necessarily want to name your child after, because he has a little bit of more controversy around him. And so they asked to have it changed to Black Elk Peak, because Black Elk is quite famous in the South Dakota region. He's a famous medicine man. He is famous for more than just being Native American, but for his contributions. And he went out and performed with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He performed for Queen Victoria in England. He's not just some nobody who happened to be Native American. There's a connection there, and it's an important place for the Sioux people. It's not their indigenous name for the mountains. That's something else, and I won't try to butcher the name, but their indigenous name means owl maker, because the peaks resemble owls. But the state of South Dakota put forward this, and the Sioux Nation put forward this request for a name change, and the board had to sit down and consider it and look at the history and say, who has a greater significance here, and what is the support? Is there a huge support to keep Kearney's name on there? Is there a huge amount of support to change the name and make a reasoned decision? And much like the decision on Kauai, their decision was unanimous. There weren't, people abstaining from this. Wasn't a whole lot of opposition to it. It's somewhat different when it comes to Mauna Kea, though. Mauna Kea, as we know, is Hawaii's high point, and the difference with Mauna Kea isn't that people want to change its name, they want to change how it's spelled. So most of us who have visited Mauna Kea have seen it spelled as two words, Mauna Kea, and sometimes you will see it spelled as one word. And the Hawaiian language is much like other indigenous languages, is mostly passed on by oral tradition. So a lot of things weren't written down, and it wasn't until American and British missionaries were in the Hawaiian Islands, they started writing down a lot of the Hawaiian language. But if you write down Mauna Kea as two separate words, it is very easy to mistranslate it as White Mountain. Versus if it's as one word, according to the University of Hawaii at Hilo, they suggest it as one word, because then it's closer to its indigenous meaning, which is mountain of Wakea. And so Wakea is one of the Hawaiian gods. They've got, again, I don't want to butcher any names, but the female goddess is Papa and the male god is Wakea, and together they create the Hawaiian Islands. The biggest and most important and the firstborn is Hawaii, and the center mountain of that is Hawaii's mountain or Wakea's mountain. And so the traditional name is Kamoana a Wakea, which means the mountain of Wakea, traditional god and father of Hawaii. That's a little bit more significant than the just White Mountain. And so the push now is to spell it as just a singular word so that it's very clear to people that they are referring to Mountain of Wakea, not White Mountain. It can be both ways. It is approved as variants in both ways. The Hawaii Board of Geographic Names approved it one way, then reverse course again. And so as it stands right now, you will, if you go visit it today, you will see it spelled as one word on the signs. Okay. However, it is acceptable to spell it both ways, just with the acknowledgement that what it means is Wakea's mountain, not White Mountain.
Well, it's very interesting. Thanks for that very detailed overview of the Board of Geographic Names and Black Elk Peak in Mauna Kea. And as we know, the High Pointers Foundation recently, they were successful in putting a sign on Mauna Kea stating that the High Pointers Club recognizes the certain point as the summit, a high point, and that the Native people wish that you don't go any higher. And if you're there to bag a peak, you're good next to that sign. So I would say that was a win for all High Pointers. Skye and Mihai, do you have any comments about Black Elk Peak and Mauna Kea?
No, I like the logic behind it's a fascinating thing on names. Black Elk Peak, that's the other connection with Black Elk is that's where he had his vision as a young man of the world. So there's a lot of significance. And it's an interesting compromise for the Lakota Nation to go that route instead of with their traditional name. So it's that to me is very intriguing that was the decision that was made. Then I have a lot to say about Harney too, but this might not be the podcast to say it.
I didn't even know that it was called Harney Peak at one point until somebody on the show accidentally said Harney Peak.
Yeah.
And he goes, oh no, I mean Black Elk Peak, because when he climbed it, it was Harney Peak. And I think that goes back to a conversation we were having earlier is we know mountains as we know them in relation to our experiences on them.
And that's a whole nother piece we'll probably talk on a little bit about that, but I'll pass the mic to Mihai.
So my only comments on these two peaks are, so for Black Elk, I'm of the opinion that things should be named not for individuals in general, but like for features or like for something that's culturally significant. So as Skye just mentioned, it's very interesting that the Lakotas chose to honor a chief with the name as opposed to their traditional name for the entire range, which is the Black Hills. That's kind of my comment in general on naming for individuals versus features or culturally significant landmarks to a certain group of people. As far as Mauna Kea goes, I am aware that the High Pointers Foundation put that sign there. I did go to the actual summit of the mountain, the highest point, and as a peak bagger, in our hobby, to climb a mountain and to climb a summit, you have to be at the summit, right? That's kind of like the definition of that. I understand why people would make the decision to stop at the sign because it is done by cultural request, but technically you are not at the summit on that one. And there's a significant difference between where you are asked to stop versus where you should stop. There's actually, it's not close, it's not within walking distance. I mean, it still takes you like a good 15-20 minutes
Okay.
to get to that high point. So in this case, you're not actually climbing a mountain, so you can't really claim the summit for that one. But I do understand the cultural sensitivity in regards to asking people to stop there because the locals feel that it is insensitive to go. So this, I think, kind of comes down to each individual's decision and views. As long, in my opinion, as long as you're not disturbing anything and you're just walking with leave no trace, I don't see a problem with it. So
Hmm.
those are just comments, but that's also a different discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Paty, go ahead.
I did want to bring something else up that Mihai and Skye mentioned with regard to Black Elk Peak. And maybe this would have been different for Denali if this rule had been in place, but today the Board of Geographic Names says that you do not name something in honor of somebody until they've been deceased for 5 years. And so, I think there's a tendency to want to name something in honor of somebody, particularly if something traumatic happened, like they were assassinated, like McKinley, or they're very popular, like George Washington. I mean, how many things are named after George Washington, right? Not that he's the only person to name something after, but I think it's also important to give time and space between that person's lifetime and what their legacy is going to be, because we don't always know how people fit into history until well after they're gone. And so
That's a
I
good point.
think that having that time frame of not naming something after somebody for 5 years is really a good benchmark.
You're right. It kind of lets the dust settle a little bit. And like you said, you see what the legacy is. And you don't know that until it is history. And you can look back and then name something appropriately. I like that. Mihai.
I was just going to make a point here, but using an example from down under in Australia, right? So the highest mountain on the Australian mainland is named after Tadeusz Kościuszko, which is who was a Polish patriot who fought to gain Polish independence in Europe. So he was more than half a world away, but for whatever reason, Polish immigrants to Australia attached the name to the highest mountain on their continent. So it is a very consequential decision to name something after an individual, as is the case here and in all the examples that we mentioned so far.
Yeah, that is interesting. And back to the sign on Mauna Kea about not going past that sign and that the High Pointers recognize it. I think that the High Pointers Foundation did a good thing in establishing that sign, because as High Pointers and as a High Point Club, we do attract a lot of people to one place for one reason, and it's to get that high point. And I think the purpose behind it was just having, taking some responsibility and say, like, yeah, these are all High Pointers. These are our people here. We can place the sign here to let them know that for our purpose of summiting the high points, as we recognize them, that they can stand here and they don't have to go to the summit. But as Mihai mentioned, peak bagging in technicality, you would have to go to the summit. But I think it was responsible on the High Pointers Foundation to put that sign up, and they do a lot of great things for the maintenance and the proper care of a lot of our high points. So let's move on to some of the high points that are named after Indigenous individuals. Now we recognize Black Elk Peak, but then there's also Hawkeye Point in Iowa and Mount Greylock. Paty, can you start us off on those two?
Well, I do want to clarify that there's not 100% certainty that Hawkeye Point is named after the Sauk chief Black Hawk. There's a lot of, long storied history about what a Hawkeye is, and there's two things that were somewhat happening at the same time. There was a publication of the book Last of the Mohicans, which I think more of us know as a movie than as a book, but it was published during the same time frame that they were coming up for a nickname for the people of the state. And the Sauk chief Black Hawk was also quite famous during that time frame, because as he was arrested and he was in captivity or in confinement by the U.S. government, he told his life story to a writer who then, transcribed it, put it down, and it was published as his autobiography because he told it, and it became an instant bestseller. So you have both of these things happening at the same time, and so there is no certainty that the two people who came up with the word Hawkeye for the people of Iowa, which one they were actually relying upon. But the fact is that it is potentially a huge influence on why they wanted to create that as a nickname for the state.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Skye, what are your thoughts?
I think it's interesting. Well, as soon as you mentioned James Fenimore Cooper's Last Mohicans, I was like, Natty Bumppo, Deerslayer, Hawkeye. The guy's got multiple names in the stories. There's 4 stories in that. It's not just The Last Mohicans. There's actually a variety. And he does finish his life past the Mississippi. So it's interesting, that whole legacy of books. And, the Iowans are very proud Hawkeyes, unless, of course, you went to Iowa State. And then you're not. But I should say, that one, it's funny, that particular high point, I think most folks that visit it don't recognize the name beyond that it's a state nickname. And
I didn't either before I was reading up for this podcast. And
I think, considering how Hawkeye Point presents itself as this all things Iowa agriculture sort of place, because it was a farm, I think it's very easy for people to not think beyond the fact that it's just, this is Iowa, Hawkeye Point. That makes perfect sense.
Kind of like Hoosier Hill?
Kind of like Hoosier Hill. And with that being said, that is a perfect reinforcing, well, of course, Hoosier Hill, Hawkeye Point, state nicknames. These are acceptable names to name a thing, especially when it's something that's not as, say, grand as Mount Elbert. I love both of those peaks very much. Both of those high points very much, but they're not the kind of places you normally take people to win them over into the hobby, so to speak.
Good way of putting it.
But when you have a place like Tomsock Mountain, which I know we'll probably get to, another one, I think the Piankashaw chief, I hope I said that tribal name right, but there's, in some ways, you're separating legend and it gets complex. Black Hawk as an individual and Black Hawk's War and, where it finished out very terrible at the Bad Axe Massacre. What are we trying to showcase with that name? I wrestle with this a lot. Are you using the name to grab a legacy? Are you using a name to say, oh, they were a good person, but they're vanquished? I don't know if that quite makes sense, but when we're dealing with these names, there's a lot of sensitivity around them because they become places where people really have memory tied to it. So I'm hoping I set somebody up to continue on that particular train of thought.
Yeah, you do bring up a good point. There's a lot of bloodshed in some of these places, and so sensitivity is absolutely a concept that needs to be considered when naming it. And now that we've gone over this board of geographic names, I would just love to sit in, when decisions are being made and to hear what they're discussing and to also hear what's written in these proposals. Mihai, what are your thoughts on Hawkeye Point and also Tomsock.
Yeah, so regarding what Skye just said right now, the diversity of high points that we have in the United States also kind of drives how they're named, I feel. All the big peaks in the West tend to be named after the people who kind of map them, or somehow cataloged them, or brought some order to them. Of course, we understand there was like an oral tradition with the indigenous communities that lived around these peaks and these mountains, but they weren't gathered in one compendium that kind of sorted them. And a lot of this, of course, came with the way the United States expanded. We created territories first, and then we created states out of those territories. So there was like some measure of uniformity that they were trying to implement, as Patty described earlier. So a lot of the peaks in the West, in addition to being actual mountains, they are also significant landmarks that had to be named so that people knew where they were in relation to the map. Whereas on the other side of the country, where you have lower mountains and then unimpressive hills, it kind of makes sense that once the territory started accepting settlers and then became a state, that people who resided in that place attached a name to what was discovered to be the high point of their administrative unit, whatever that was, right? So, in that sense, I think it's good to have a mix of nicknames, and then indigenous names, and then whatever the settlers or the officials that happen to go around bequeath to these landmarks. Um, we can go overboard, of course, with the naming, because in recent years we've seen all the states adopt an official bird or an official animal, official flower, official whatever. So it's easy to like just do too much in terms of naming, but I think that has to do with what Skye also mentioned, which is that people seek a sense of identity, right? So if you're an Iowan, your highest point is named Hawkeye Point because you identify as a Hawkeye. That's your state nickname. Everyone is that by default who lives in that state or is born in that state, whatever. Um, as for Tom Sock, I think and I don't think the mountain is in the Ozark range. I think it's a different range, but it is actually higher mountains there, and they were inhabited by the natives. So it does make sense to go with a native name in that instance, I think.
Skye.
You also get a sense of, to touch on what Mihai said, ownership of these places, private ownership. That's not as relevant out in the Western Peaks when they were mapping that frontier, where it wasn't that long ago that Hawkeye Point was privately owned. Who has the right to name that point? I mean, if that family had lived there Driscoll Mountain is a great example, privately owned, has been for like a century and a half by the same family, the Driscolls. They're still there. That's their mountain. If you're being mountain's doing a lot of heavy lifting in Louisiana, but that's for all intents and purposes been their land for 150 years, probably longer than that now. And that's Driscoll Mountain, and that's how it's mapped. That's how it's cataloged. That's how it's benchmarked. Everything about it, and it's a privately owned entity. Hoosier Hill, privately owned. If new owners come in, if that land gets sold, I know there's rules about this, but some of these places, you could probably start putting a pretty good case that if a family lived there for 100 years, to shift the name.
That's a very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Patty, can you take us through the process of naming private land?
I don't know that I have too much to offer on that other than to say that often with the high points that are on private land, it's discovered much later than one would think. So, for example, like with Iowa's high point, throughout much of the 19th and the 20th century, people didn't realize that the high point was where Hawkeye Point currently is. They thought it was a mound, Trident Mound, I believe is how you pronounce the name. And they believed that this mound was much higher, and it was only in like 1971 when surveyors go out there that they realize that the small rise near the pig trough on the farm is higher than this other much more distinctive mound. And I do have to give some credit to the families that do own some of these high points, realizing that this is going to be something that other people in the community, other people in the state are going to take pride in. Other people are going to want to come and visit. And so, like with the family that owned Hawkeye Point, I think choosing the state nickname, even if they didn't understand where Hawkeye might have originated, knowing that was a point of pride within their state and making that deliberate choice to choose a name that was going to resonate with more than just themselves, instead of just naming it after themselves. Hoosier Hill. Most of us don't know what the heck a Hoosier is. Most Hoosiers don't know what a Hoosier is. But, making that deliberate decision was a very thoughtful choice, because you have to recognize, as a private landowner, I could choose to name it anything I want, and I think there's a tendency to want to name things after ourselves or leave some sort of family legacy, and it takes somebody with a little bit more foresight to say, okay, I'm creating a legacy here, and what do I want it to be for all the people in my state or all the people in my community?
That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And Paty just wrote in the last Apex to Zenith issue, she just wrote an article about Charles Mound. So be sure to check that out. And the way to get the Apex to Zenith magazine is to become a High Pointers Club member. So a little plug there. All right, now let's move on to non-Indigenous name changes. And Mihai, I would like to start off with you because we can talk about Mount Whitney since it is in your backyard. Mihai comes to us from Bishop, California.
Yeah, so I live in Bishop, as Lauren just mentioned, which is 60 miles away as the crow flies from the summit of Mount Whitney. It has been known as Mount Whitney for basically a long time, since I think the 1800s, named after Josiah Whitney, who was the head of the USGS survey that mapped part of the Sierra Nevada in the beginning. The native name for the peak in the Paiute language is Tumanguya. And lately there has been an effort in this region where I live, which is known as the Eastern Sierra, to revert, or not revert, but start applying more indigenous names. The Owens Valley, which is where Bishop is, and where a lot of the population lives, has started to be called Payahunadu, which is the land of the water, because of the Owens River. So don't quote me on the exact name. I don't remember right now. But that is just an example of more native names starting to be applied here. And of course, the area has a lot of history with the settlers that came in and kind of started farming in the Owens Valley. And then, of course, the water wars, when the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power came in and acquired water rights to start pulling water and send down to the Los Angeles area via a 200-mile aqueduct. So there is a lot of controversy here, too, in that regard. But I think the names of the mountains themselves and the topographic features have not been challenged in any way, or in any significant way, I would say. There is a lower peak south of Whitney that has been named Mount Muir for John Muir, the famous conservationist and explorer at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And I know at some point there was an effort to swap Mount Whitney and Mount Muir, because people thought that having Muir's name attached to the highest mountain in the Sierra Nevada was a fitting tribute to this man who had done so much to encourage conservation of the entire mountain range. He was, of course, pivotal in establishing Yosemite National Park, and then Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, which protect a vast swath of the mountain range. So in this case, we have an example of an individual who was instrumental in getting the protection for the mountain range that we all take advantage of these days to actually go in there and climb these mountains. Otherwise, they would probably be in private hands by now. But because it wasn't controversial enough, the first settlers who settled in Owens Valley, they started naming Mount Whitney Fisherman's Peak. And I think Paty can speak to this a bit more. So you have contending names for Mount Whitney. How do we decide which one is the right one? Is it Tumanguya, the native name from the Paiutes? Is it Fisherman's Peak from the first white settlers who set eyes on it? Or is it Mount Whitney from the official federal agency that kind of established it? So these are not easy questions. I think there needs to be a lot more discussion, but probably all three names would be okay as official names.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Paty, can you tell us more about Fisherman's Peak?
Sure. My understanding, and this is very much very close to what Mihai has told. There's the Paiute people have been in that region for such a long time, and of course when Whitney shows up, he's with a surveying team who includes Clarence King of Kings Peak fame, and Whitney's a challenging person because his legacy is not necessarily what we would like it to be. And so that's where sometimes these challenges come, is we don't look at the people as they are in the time. We look at them and compare them to what we would hope them to be today. And maybe he would have been different with more knowledge about glaciers and not denying them. But the mountain was in fact named Whitney, and King was part of helping name that mountain Whitney as part of that expedition. And King tried to climb that mountain several times, and he was unsuccessful. He ended up on the top of different mountains. He just, he got weathered off. He had all these different challenges. And it was the fishermen. Exactly. We've all been there. God help us if Rainier had tried to climb Mount Rainier. But it was three fishermen from the Owens Valley, where Mihai is, that were the first to actually successfully record a climb there. Now, I'm not saying they were the first people to ever climb it. I'm sure there were probably Paiute people who did in fact climb it, and we're not going to know their names. But when the fishermen those three fishermen did climb it, there was a thought about, well, maybe they have a greater connection to the mountain than Whitney did when he was surveying it. And that therein lies a challenge. Who has the greatest connection to a mountain? And although there was legislation to try to rename it, and it did pass the California legislature, and it did make it to the governor's desk, and it was just the fact that it made it there on April Fool's Day, and he thought it was an April Fool's joke, and vetoed it. It might be called Fisherman's Peak. But, there will always be somebody in each generation that feels that they have a stronger connection to a particular mountain or mountain range or piece of this earth. And we're all here temporarily. So, I don't think we can go in one direction and say that we rename things with each generation. And I don't think we can go historically and only go with indigenous names. We have to just try to make the best call that we can make with the information that we have.
I agree. Skye, what are your thoughts on that?
It's part of the reason these names have such power is because we form really big memories when we go to these places. Particularly the higher ones, the ones where you have to invest time, muscle, blood, and guts, so to speak. Money, the whole, so I climbed Mount Whitney last year, and it was an amazing 2-day adventure with some of my best friends. And that episode will be coming soon. We filmed a lot. But more than that was having this amazing experience with people that I love in my life. And so when I look at that, I think of it as Mount Whitney. I bundle that up in there. Mm-hmm. The name is associated now with this very strong memory. You saw it with your pod when you mentioned Harney Peak. Mm-hmm. There will be a generation out there that they summited Harney Peak. And if they summited in dire conditions or in some epic fashion, it's going to be harder to pull that name away. Because this is very much the human condition. Our memories are what make us who we are. And so these places and the names associated with them become very compelling. And part of the reason I think controversy stems is people take ownership. They're taking ownership of their memories, and by extension, they take ownership of the peak.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, this is great, because if you feel pride of place, for example, I grew up 30 miles away from Timms Hill. I loved that place. It's not the greatest high point in the world, but for me, it's super special. And every time I go there, if there's litter or something, I pick it up because that place means a lot to me. And so names become an extension of ownership.
You're right. And I want to just get slightly off topic a little bit, but it will come back around, I promise, when we talk about military bases. Now, Paty and Skye, I think, I know you're both veterans, and I am as well. And I'm stationed right now. Well, my husband is active duty, and so we're at Fort Liberty right now. It was formerly known as Fort Bragg when I was there. And so when I talk to other people saying where I was stationed, I say Bragg. And you know who you're talking to, or you know when they were there, when they simply say Bragg. You don't have to say Fort, you just say Bragg. And that's all you need to know. Okay, so you were there at this time. If somebody is saying, I was stationed at Fort Liberty, I would know, okay, these are the years that you probably served because you're calling it this. Or I would say, I went to airborne school at Fort Benning. I don't know what it's called now. But if I were, in the service, I would call it the correct name. But when I say Benning, that tells you more or less what time I was there, in that it wasn't recent. Or I went to officer candidate school at Benning. I went to basic officer leader course at Fort Lee. And so I say that because it's tied to my experience there, similar to what Skye was saying about how Whitney is part of his experience that he had on the mountain. And I had a guest on the podcast once who was talking about shared experiences and how military members often have that, and how they form close bonds with other people because you experienced a specific thing with them. We can tie that concept to the experiences that we have on high points, whatever they were called at the time. Let's say somebody summited what we know as Denali today, but it was Mount McKinley at that time. They're going to say that I summited Mount McKinley. I have a book right here written by, oh my God, what's his name? Fred Becky. And it's called The Mountains of North America. And he has Mount McKinley in there. And to him, that is Mount McKinley. And Paty, can you go into a little detail about what certain peaks mean something to you, and maybe does it have anything to do with the name? And also, can you talk about the military base name change that we're seeing right now, or at least in recent history?
Sure. Let me start with the second one, the military base, because much like you, I served of a certain generation. I've been out for 6 years now, and all the military bases, or at least a good portion of them, had completely different names. And so when I talk to some of my friends that are still in, and they say, oh, I'm at such and such base, and I'm like, where is that? And they'll tell me the old name because we haven't gotten used to it yet. I think with time, maybe we do, right? Yeah. Names change over time, and so does culture. I think the difference with the military base is this. It wasn't done. It may seem like it was done on a whim, but it wasn't done on a whim. There had been talk about it for generations and decades. And part of what goes behind that is, what legacy do we want to go as we move forward? In the same way that I was talked about somebody being really thoughtful about naming a state high point, Hawkeye, or Hoosier, and trying to get as many people excited about that and make it as inclusive as possible. With our military bases, I think we also have to look back on, and try to be very sensitive with this as well, is, we ask our military to go off and fight our nation's wars. And then if they have to come back and serve on a base that's named after who they fought, or their children are serving on a base after somebody that they fought against, that's a really bitter pill to swallow. So I know you served in Iraq. My husband served in Iraq. If our son, my husband's and my son were to go serve on Fort Saddam Hussein, it would be a very bitter pill for us to swallow. And so I think there was a long movement in the military to change some of those names that were named after Confederate generals because the U.S. military fought against those. And it's somewhat different when we're talking about renaming peaks, but somewhat the same as well as what legacy do we want to leave behind as people are climbing these peaks. We want to have pride in them, right? Nobody wants to name something that they don't have pride in. And as for me, some of the favorite ones that I've climbed personally, I have great experiences on Katahdin. And to me, Katahdin is just Katahdin. There is no mount in front of it. I know that technically on the map it says mount, but it was more than just a mountain for me. The first time I climbed it as a day hike with my husband and my son. But the second time that I summited Katahdin was at the end of a 2,200-mile journey, walking from Georgia to Maine. And every single day when I woke up, that mountain was calling me. It was Katahdin. It was a goal for me. And so it has a very special place in my heart, not just because of its indigenous name, but because every single day for 4 months straight, I woke up thinking about Katahdin, thinking about making it to the end of my journey and summiting that mountain. And so, as we've discussed, all of us have discussed throughout this, is a name is really important when it becomes a talisman to you, when it becomes part of your memory, when it becomes part of your experience, when it becomes a thing that you're going to talk to other people about. All you have to do is say the word Katahdin in front of a bunch of Appalachian Trail hikers, and the smile lights up on their face, and they all want to tell you their story about Katahdin. So, the names can be really important to people.
That's so interesting. And I remember you talking about that on the podcast. And I also had another AT thru hiker on the show once, and I said, tell me about Katahdin. And he let out this huge, he exhaled, and it was so long, and he closed his eyes, and he just needed a minute to just get it all together and tell me about Katahdin. And it was so special to him. And that's how he opened his explanation of Katahdin. And I think that's something that only if you've hiked the Appalachian Trail, you would have that experience. Of course, anyone can have, any experience they have on Katahdin, but I'm sure it's something very special to anyone who has done the northbound hike. Mihai, what is a peak that is very special to you, that when you hear the name of it, something happens?
Yeah, so my example on this one is, again, outside the United States. The most meaningful to me was the Romania high point, which is called Moldovanu. I came to the United States as a teenager, so I spent my formative years in this country. And before we left from Romania, I never had a chance to engage in these kind of activities. So as an adult, to have the opportunity to go back and climb my native country's high point was very meaningful to me. There's, since we're talking about names, there is no controversy about the name of the highest mountain in Romania. That is well accepted over there, and not disputed in any way. But the mountain was meaningful to me, and the experience. I happened to do it by myself. I wish I had more people with me, but that's just how the schedule worked out in that instance. I wanted to circle back to the military base naming, and as the only non-military person on this panel, the way I look at this is military service is kind of a duty, whereas high pointing is just a hobby, right? So they are different things. They have different meanings. Ultimately, it is about leaving a legacy in each instance. It is all about making memories for each person, whether you're climbing or serving. But renaming military bases is not the same as renaming peaks, as far as I'm concerned. And there's a huge difference. I think in terms of leaving a legacy, like Skye was mentioning, right? You tend to associate certain peaks with certain memories because you put all this effort and energy into accomplishing that. Whereas serving it's a much more meaningful action, I think, because you are giving something back to your country that way. So, um, I can't speak as to why it would be meaningful to rename a military installation because I don't have that experience. But as far as peak bagging goes, yeah, it's all about what it was named when you did it, and it'll be forever etched in your memory in that way, I think.
Yeah. I think the high point that's most memorable to me with the name is Mount Rainier. Because before I started actually climbing mountains, I was the armchair, what do they call it? Armchair explorer. I mean, I still am. And I would read about these people who went off to the Himalayas to do these really great expeditions. And they always started on Mount Rainier. I'm talking about the American ones, of course. They started on Mount Rainier. They started in the Cascades, of course, the other ranges in the United States, but a lot of them came from out of Seattle. And I was like, what is this Mount Rainier? And so when I came home from Iraq, I just had this desire to just get out and do something because. Well, and also where we were in Iraq, I was in Erbil, Iraq, and on a clear day, you could see the Iraqi high point. And every day I was just looking at these mountains and I'm like, man, when I get home, I'm going to climb a mountain. And so I went on a women's climb of Mount Rainier, and it was just very special to me, I think, because I trained so hard for it. I was the only one on the team that came from sea level, didn't know what I was doing, but I just did so much research and I read so many books about climbing and Mount Rainier and all the history. And I read the full accident report of the whole national park too, just to be safe. And it was just, it started this whole fascination with state high points. And I didn't do it to do a state high point. I did it because it's Mount Rainier. And I'm like, oh, wait, it's also a state high point. Oh, and I climbed up Mount Mitchell too. That's because I live in North Carolina and I'm fascinated with our state parks. And that was the first state park in North Carolina. So it started me on my high point journey, and I will never, ever forget that. Now let's talk about real quick, what does the future hold for name changes? And what are some, maybe Mihai, can you talk about international disputes for high points? I mean, we have Everest, which has 3 names depending on what country you're in. And what does the future look like around the world for name changes?
I think internationally, a lot of the naming is driven by conflict. There's been a lot of bloodshed spilled over who acquires what territory, who owns what territory, and so on and so forth. Everest is the biggest example of a mountain having multiple names based on the cultures that interacted with it throughout the years. Everest, of course, is the British name that was bestowed on it, but it is also known as Chomolungma on the Nepali side and Sagarmatha on the Tibetan side. And a lot of people continue to refer to the mountain by those names, which is nothing wrong. I don't think anyone is disputing that. It just kind of matters from which side you approach the mountain to refer to. I think Everest is easier internationally from a marketing perspective because everyone knows where it is, and it's also an English sounding name, and it's easier to pronounce and remember for most people.
Well, we also use it as a metaphor now.
And
everyone has their own Mount Everest, right?
Exactly. By definition, the highest, the superlatives kind of drive also our language, right? So in this case, that's of course very true of Everest as well. A couple of other examples that I was going to mention were in New Zealand, the highest mountain on the South Island is of course Mount Cook, which a few years ago was renamed Awaraki as well for the Maori name.
Okay.
So it seems pretty well established that in New Zealand, the majority of the population accepts both names. and they don't have an issue with calling it one or the other, depending on what your preference is. So that's an example of actually of a country where they kind of got that down. There's the white settler population and then the native Maori population, and they both agreed to call this mountain by two official names. So in that respect, I think New Zealand is an example for other countries. But of course, it's a smaller country, and for things like Australia, or let's go to Turkey, for example, an area that has seen conflict for millennia at this point. The highest mountain there, which we know by the name of Ararat, um, the Turks call it Agridagi, which is the official Turkish name. And it has a bunch of other names too, depending on the culture surrounding it. I think in that instance, it will be very hard to find a consensus, since it's a matter of ownership, as we said over and over again on this podcast. Who can claim the mountain to be theirs? And of course, there's all sorts of cultural significance associated with these mountains. Um, each culture feels like they're defined by their relation to that mountain, and then thus the mountain should be named only what they say it should be. So I don't think the conflict will ever go away internationally, honestly. I think in the United States we have an easier time coming to an agreement on this, um, just because we have a much better established federal system that kind of, as Paty explained, has an official agency assigned to naming things and to making decisions about names. And then the last example I wanted to throw out was, of course, the highest mountain in, um, not in all of Europe, but in Western Europe, which is Mont Blanc in France. That is also known as Monte Bianco in Italian, and it straddles the border between the two countries. So, of course, it will have a name in each language. Um, so, in places that have multiple languages and cultures going on, the naming will always be a matter of controversy because there's not one that can claim ownership. Whereas here, where we have an official language, I think it's much easier.
Well, thank you for that. Skye, what do you think the future holds for name changes?
I'll take a slightly scoped down version. I have this wild theory that if there were two peaks in the U.S., that could probably get a name change. I could see it being Mount Hood or Mount Rainier, particularly with the 250th anniversary of U.S. independence coming up. Both Hood and Rainier were British Navy, if I remember correctly, and both fought against the United States. I want to say, I can't remember who fought in the Revolution and who fought in the War of 1812, but they were the opposition. And of course, that one point, that was the domain of the British, the Oregon Territory, 54 fight, the whole works. That's a whole nother story. And we won't talk about James Polk. But I could just see something happen there. I don't know if it would be successful, but I could see something with that. But I think overall, there might be rumblings here and there, but I think some of the bigger wins have happened. Things will settle down maybe a little bit. Maybe they drop the mount off of Katahdin, but overall, I don't see much change coming up for U.S. high points.
Yeah. Paty?
I think that there's a tendency to think that when we see something like Kauai, which we started this episode with, changing to its indigenous name, and Denali, the discussion between that indigenous name and somebody else's surname, that there's a tendency to think that this is about its historical Native American name versus an English name or somebody's surname. And I don't think that that's always true. I don't think that if you were to rename, as Skye was talking about, the two peaks in the Pacific Northwest and take away their British surname honorifics, and call them by Tahoma and Wy'east again, they would probably go back to their indigenous names. But I think, as we can see from South Dakota, it's not always the same. That's not the same drive. It's more about people in the local area having connection and ownership and memories with what's around them. Places don't have to go back to an indigenous name to be meaningful to the people that live around them. And I think that's what's really important. And I think that's what's driven a lot of the conflict around Denali-McKinley and that debate back and forth, and senators and representatives introducing legislation in Congress for decades of it should be this, no, it should be that, is, this sentiment that really McKinley had no connection to Alaska. And the people who live in Alaska, the people who do have a connection to it, whether they are white newcomers or native Alaskans, they should have the overarching, say in what that mountain is going to be called, because they're the ones who look at it every day. They're not going to come and visit it for 4 days and then go back home to wherever they came from. Every single day, that's part of their life. And I think that's where some of the buy-in needs to be. And I think that's probably why the board came up with the principle or the rule of, we're not going to just name things what they used to be called. We need a better reason to rename something than it was once called this.
Yeah, that's a good point. Skye.
Yeah, there's also a thought I have. Part of the reason some names probably are more successful than others is if the place looks appealing. Both Hood, Rainier, Denali, they're very striking. Mount Whitney, very striking peak. They're beautiful. Whereas if you were going to launch a campaign to probably rename Hoosier Hill, you might have an easier go at it. I hate to say, but vanity or
prominence
look of a place, has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, Mihai and then Paty.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point that Skye made just now, which is a lot of this has to do with the accessibility, right? Not just the prominence, but how easy is it to get to this high point? And as we all know, the Western high points are much harder to summit than the ones in the rest of the country. So again, you're establishing something as a matter of ownership and control by giving names to these landmarks, let's call them, right? Because Rainier on a clear day, you can see from anywhere around Puget Sound. Same thing with Hood and Portland and so on and so forth. So you kind of organize your life. If you happen to live in that area, you organize your life by what you can see on the horizon. And this has been the case for generations for those people. So I feel that accessibility and being able to visualize something plays a much greater role in naming it as opposed to Campbell Hill in Ohio or Hoosier Hill or any of these other examples that we mentioned that are just insignificant hills if you think about them.
Mm-hmm. Paty, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think also and I stumbled over some of the Native American names, and I don't want to disrespect or dishonor anybody, but I think that the indigenous names that seem to be the most successful are the ones that are easy to pronounce. Denali is easy to pronounce. Katahdin is easy to pronounce. If you go to Arizona's indigenous name, there's a lot of vowels and there's some apostrophes. Yeah. And again, nobody wants to be the person who is butchering a name and being disrespectful. So I think the appetite to change it back to an indigenous name would be less so, just because Humphreys is easy to pronounce or easier to pronounce than maybe another name. And so I think that also plays somewhat of a role in when people are talking about, let's say, if we wanted to rename Rainier to Tahoma, well, guess what? Those are both easy names. And then, so maybe it's a little bit more palatable for people to accept. I mean, I'm sure the people of Washington have no problem saying the word Tahoma because Tacoma is right there. But, I think that also plays somewhat of a role in the names that we are willing to embrace.
That's a good point. Well, that's a good segue into the next question, which is, if you could rename a high point, which one would it be and why? I'll start this off. I would change Mount Rainier to Tahoma because in all my research that I did before I climbed Mount Rainier, I read all about Little Tahoma. I remember thinking, well, why not? Why not Big Tahoma? And that's basically it. And also, I think that, talking to people who live around the mountain, I mean, Tahoma is a common word there. And to your point, Paty, I don't think that it would be a really big change. It's easy to say. And the mountain is very visible, accessible, everything. Skye, what high point would you change?
I would change the one I grew up closest to. I would move Tim's Hill to Ostrigan's Cool. Because I feel this goes back to an article I read when I was doing my initial research on that high point years and years ago in a defunct newspaper called Rib Lake Herald. The guy who gave it its original name wasn't even the surveyor. Leonard Reisberg was the guy who actually did the survey that determined that Tim's Hill in the highlands of Wisconsin there was actually taller than Rib Mountain. And it was huge. It was a big deal at the time. Rib Mountain really stands out. If you ever seen it, as you're driving north up on I-39, you'll go right by it. It really looks the role. So whereas Tim's Hill, stuck in the highlands with a bunch of other hills really of similar size and nature, including Pearson's Hill, which people in Price County still are arguing is taller than Tim's Hill. But Timothy McGahan was an owner of a sawmill there who came, logged the land, moved on. And that's who it's named after, his first name. They gave it the extra M to make it look more official. But the Reverend Ostrigan was the guy, one of the people that lived on that hill that helped bring over the Swedish folks to Ogama back when it was getting started up as a rail town, as a logging town. He was one of the agents responsible for those immigrants getting settled there. He was the local minister. And cool, of course, is Swedish word for hill. And frankly, I just like weird names. So like Ebright Asmith, I love the fact we have a high point named that because it's so weird. Ebright makes sense, Asmith doesn't. But so that's the one I'd rename.
That's a good one. Mihai, what's yours?
I actually have two, and so bear with me. And the reason why I have two is because, like Skye, I like unique names. I think we have too many names that are the same across different states, territories, whatever. And I understand it's because of that's what those settlers named them at the time. But we do need more variety, I feel, in that regard. So my two are first Wheeler in New Mexico. I think it would be good to take that one back to Cerro de Taos, which was the Spanish name for it. Back when the Spanish came into New Mexico. And I sent this research to Paty. We don't have a lot of sources on this, but I think it was named after the tribe that originally lived downstream on the banks of the Rio Grande. So I think that would be a much more appropriate name for that peak, and also very unique, and also related to the town at the base of it, which is, of course, Taos, a great little place. The other one I would rename would be Granite in Montana, because we have tons of granite mountains everywhere in the West. And saying, oh, I climbed Granite without saying the Montana State High Point is something that is not easy to explain to people, and you have to bring an additional explanation. So probably a good, just to finish my thought, a good name for that one would be something related to the Absaroka people in that area, and I think Paty can suggest something better. But those would be my two.
Those are good. Paty, what are your suggestions?
Well, I love Mihai's suggestion on Granite Peak, and I think naming it after something in the Absaroka people would be wonderful. On that same vein, I would consider renaming Eagle Mountain as well, because like how many Eagle Mountains are there? I mean, I love that it's our national bird, but there's one that's not even 100 miles away in the same state,
The
and
more
so
popular ski resort.
exactly. So I think perhaps the people of Minnesota can do better, but my personal favorite that I would choose to rename would be my home mountain, Mount Hood, here in Oregon. And I would choose to have it go back to its original name, Y East. And there's all kinds of things already associated with Y East on Mount Hood right now. You've got, the Y East Lodge as part of the Timberline Lodge. You've got the Y East Wonder, which is an ultra marathon that's run on the slopes of Mount Hood. But I think for me, the reason why I would like to see it go back to Y East is because it tells the story of what happens in this region. So the story is that the great, god of the Multnomah people, Sahali, had two sons, one of which was Y East. So you have the two sons of Sahali, and they are battling over this maiden named Luwit. And there's all this, as they're battling back and forth, you've got the forest getting on fire, and you've got the rumbling of them throwing each other around, and if eventually Sahali just smites all three of them, the two brothers and the maiden that they're after, and those mountains become Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Adams. But what that does is it describes what was happening or what the indigenous people saw happening around them, the wildfires, the earthquakes, the volcanoes erupting. And I think that's a beautiful part of our history here in the Pacific Northwest that I'd like us to recapture. And the name somewhat does that.
So I know that the format of this episode is different than my typical episodes, but I would like to finish this off by asking if anyone has any book, podcast, or documentary outdoor-related recommendations. Skye, why don't we start with you?
So there's two things I'll recommend.
Mm-hmm.
One is more serious. It's a book called Names on the Land by George Stewart. I see Patty's already nodding her head. It's an interesting deep dive into why things are named what they are. It's now over half a century old, so it's a little dated, but it's still a really compelling read. It's well worth looking at the book, Names on the Land, George Stewart. The other is a comedic bit. I can't think of a comedian right now talking about how states got their zip codes, or not zip codes, but their abbreviations. You can find that on YouTube. Not necessarily appropriate for work, but it's really funny.
Awesome. We'll check that out. Mihai, do you have anything that you've been reading lately? Or listening to? Or watching?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with podcasts on this round of recommendations. Actually, two of them. So first one is called the Pacific Northwest Baggers Podcast.
Okay.
And it is abbreviated PNW, Peak Baggers, for Pacific Northwest.
Oh, I follow them on Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have a social media presence. I think their episodes are really good.
Okay.
I listened to a bunch of them.
All right.
And then I would also like to plug the Climbing Majority podcast. I'm not very familiar with that one. I just discovered it. And I discovered it because I listened to the interview with the Gilbertson brothers. Eric and Matthew Gilbertson are among the leading country high point climbers in the world. And their stories are absolutely fascinating. So if anyone is interested in going around the world and climbing the highest point in every country, definitely check out this podcast, specifically the Gilbertson episodes. They're awesome.
That's great. I'll check that out. Patty, what are you reading lately?
Well, I have to tell you, I've got a whole lot of history, nonfiction books sitting on my bookshelf. One that kind of dovetails with high pointing right now that I'm absolutely loving. It was probably written 1960s. It's called Surveys of the West, and it follows the four great surveys, Powell, Wheeler, King, and I'm forgetting the fourth one, but the four great surveys. Hayden, thank you. Hayden. And it follows their 4 surveys of the Western U.S., and it tells a lot of the American story. But that's probably a little dry for a lot of people. If you like something that's a lighter read and you're as big of a geography nerd as I am, there's a book called How the States Got Their Shapes by Mark Stein. And it's a fantastic little read, and you can open up your own home state or your neighboring states and figure out how it got its borders. And
That's
you'll
cool.
learn a little bit about not only your history, but your geography as well.
What a great time.
Huge fan of that book. It's
I have that
actually
book
one
too.
Yay.
there's a sequel as well.
I love
Yes,
that.
there
This is
is.
why this is the perfect panel for this episode. Everyone just lit up when Paty said that book.
Because I think we're all geography nerds at heart, right?
Yeah. So the book that I'm reading right now, it's called Appalachian Odyssey by Jeffrey Ryan. And I started it not too long ago, and it's the subtitle is a 28-year hike on America's Trail. And I have talked to a lot of through hikers, Paty being one of them, on the show. But the first section hiker that I talked to is a guy named Jason McDonald. He was a few episodes ago. And he has section hiked the AT, PCT, CDT. And that was the first time I actually considered, you can section hike this whole thing. Because I always thought, that a through hike is simply not in the cards for me just because of life. And so I kind of wrote these things off, these great trails. And then it occurred to me, I can hike sections. I might not complete all the sections, but you can still do sections of them. And so I found this book, and he talks about how obviously it took him 28 years to do this section hike, and he doesn't do it in order. And it's just like these weekends that he has off of work, or sometimes they're long 4-day weekends, and he'll just go out and hike a section of the Appalachian Trail. And it's funny to hear about all the things that don't go according to plan. Someone's car breaks down or something like that, and it's always something. But wow, does he have such great stories to tell? The next generation and the generation after that, just one adventure after another. These little, I've heard them called micro adventures. Sometimes we don't have a month or 2 months or 6 months, but you have a weekend, or you can carve one out somewhere. And I think it's a really good concept to consider in terms of accessibility into the outdoors. Everyone can find a day or something like that to go on a hike. And if you're near the Appalachian Trail like I am, that might be something you can do. So it's called Appalachian Odyssey by Jeffrey H. Ryan. So I want to thank everyone for joining this panel. Mihai, thank you for suggesting this episode. And Skye and Paty, thank you for everything that you do for the high pointing history community. Skye, for your YouTube channel, Paty, for your blog, and for the article that you write for A to Z. Your contributions to the high pointing community are greatly appreciated. And what a great time this episode comes at, right? Between the Mount McKinley renaming and then Kuohi, it's all a topic that we're all thinking of these days. And I think it's important to have civil and professional discussions about it. And what better people to do that with than the experts? So thanks everyone for doing this.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren, for hosting us.
This has been a wonderful podcast, and it's great to see all 4 of us together. And looking forward to more of the Trail Talk podcast, Lauren.